the campaigns are fully aware of this gender gap and leveraging it out to motivate turnout. Trump, for example, is aggressively courting male voters through what we call here the manosphere, which are these online forums that promote masculinity and in many cases misogyny, while Harris' campaign is leaning on reproductive rights and abortion.
First, as I mentioned, let's turn our attention to the latest twists and turns in the United States in the battle for the White House. I'm joined now by Patsy Widakuswara. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Patsy, good evening.
Hi there. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. Can you just run us through this poll and its significance, particularly in those key swing states?
Well, there are several different polls that are showing more or less similar results, which is that Harris and Trump are really competitive in what's called these battleground states or swing states. That is Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. So different polls have, different leads and different emphasis on where Harris is leading and where Trump is leading. But what we can gather from all of these different polls is that, as you say, the state of the race right now is so different than it was when President Biden was still the top of the Democratic ticket. So I'm going to say all of this, prefacing that, I've covered U.S. politics for 20 years, and I do not want to repeat the same mistake that I and almost every other journalist and analyst and pollsters made in 2016, when most of us were predicting a Hillary Clinton victory, when in fact Donald Trump won. So, these are polls, these are snapshots of what's happening right now, but there's still 2 months to the election, and a lot can happen.
In the UK, we have a phrase, shy Tories. And it refers to conservative voters who don't like being asked who they vote for. And when a pollster turns up with a clipboard and a pen and does a survey or sends a poll, rings up on the phone and asks people, these shy Tories, who they vote for, they either lie and say they vote for the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats, or they just won't admit to voting for the Conservatives. Is there a similar phenomenon with Donald Trump voters? No. Is there other shy Trump supporters out there?
Well, it's interesting because what may be a similar phenomenon is households that are husband and wife, where when a pollster calls, the wife will be unwilling to admit that she's voting for Harris, while the husband would be unwilling to vote for Trump because their spouse or their partner is the opposite of them. So that's probably something close to that, in which case it may cancel each other out. But what we know, aside from that, is that people are dug in the U.S. We can see this from the fact that there is no bounce in support for both Harris and Trump out of the conventions, which is, unusual, because usually after the convention, you get like a slight bump, 2 or 3%. But there is almost no bounce after the DNC and the RNC, which just indicates this kind of like locked in nature of this very highly polarized contest as we get into November.
How small, Patsy, is that? Are the swing voters, those who aren't dug in, and I appreciate what you've just said, but those who aren't dug in, who still are just contemplating who they might vote for, that could be so crucial in this election come November. How many voters are we talking about here potentially?
So it depends on which states, right? I mean, some states are just decidedly blue, and some states are decidedly red, and there's a much smaller sliver of voters who were still undecided. But there are some that are still up for grabs in those states that we mentioned earlier as swing states. For example, there's like 12% in Georgia and 16% in Pennsylvania. So overall, I would say somewhere between 10, 15, maybe 18% of undecided in this race. And also the fact that Harris is entering the race right now. She still has time to introduce herself, although, just two months. And she could still change a lot of minds with independents who are just, have a distaste for both candidates before that, both Trump and Biden. And so they're looking at with Harris with renewed interest. And so she's trying to catch up and trying to cover a lot of grounds, campaigning on these battleground states.
In the White House, amongst the press corps in the White House, and you're talking amongst your colleagues, you're watching this race 24/7. Is there a particular consensus? Is there a particular view as to who is going to win this election, or should I refer back to your earlier comments at the top of this interview when you said actually nobody wants to make a prediction, especially what happened after 2016?
Yes, I think that's kind of the consensus, is that nobody wants to redo their mistake. But I would say this: I would say that this election has gotten a lot more interesting to cover journalistically because there's so many unknowns, right? I mean, before, when it was still Biden on top of the ticket, I think there was very clear lack of voter enthusiasm, and that also translates to the fact that many journalists are kind of like, is this kind of like a done deal, which makes it less exciting to cover in terms of, there are no twists and turns. And right now everything's new. Things are happening on such a fluid and quick basis. So that's one thing that we're talking about amongst ourselves. And I think there's just a lot of really interesting quirks, particularly in this election. For example, the gender gap, right? Like, I mean, right now we're showing polls that women favor Harris and men favor Trump. And the gap is really most apparent among young people, which is really interesting, right? And so we're looking at why this is. Is this kind of like some sort of anxiety over shifting gender roles, which could be a contributing factor? I mean, we know many American men were uncomfortable with, the Me Too efforts to redistribute power among the genders. And also the fact that American men are doing less well than women in general. So that's just kind of like some of the nuances that we're covering in this election. And obviously the campaigns are fully aware of this gender gap and leveraging it out to motivate turnout. Trump, for example, is aggressively courting male voters through what we call here the manosphere, which are these online forums that promote masculinity and in many cases misogyny, while Harris' campaign is leaning on reproductive rights and abortion.
Patsy, thanks so much for your time this evening. Very, very grateful.